What if learning disabilities aren't permanent at all? What if the brain can literally rewire itself, even in teenagers and adults? Today's guest explains the hidden science of neuroplasticity and why most kids never get the help. And welcome back. I'm very excited to introduce Lorraine Driscoll today. Lorraine is the founder of Building Better Brains Learning Clinic. She's an educational therapist, functional health practitioner, and a former teacher who is known for her radically different approach to overcoming challenges related to learning, attention, and self-regulation. She uses a root cause multi-therapy approach to address the various reasons for learning breakdown, everything from gut health to addressing toxicity to strengthening weak connections in the brain with brain-based exercises and neurotechnologies. Her goal is to move kids beyond the limitations of IEPs, endless tutoring, and medication by optimizing brain function and improving learning ability so kids aren't working so hard to learn and self-regulate. Lorraine, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for having me. So psyched to be here.
So let's start at the beginning. First of all, so you started the Better Brains, Building a Better Brains clinic, learning clinic. Let's rewind. How did this all start? Start at the beginning.
Okay. So then we're going to go back to my first year of teaching, where
Yes.
I was disenchanted in my first year of teaching. I was about halfway through. I was trying to remain really positive. And I actually remember the kind of moment where I was like, oh gosh, what have I gotten myself into? I had a class, grade 8 class, tons of kids with IEPs, many of them who could barely read. And I went down to the principal and I'm like, I don't even know how to work with these kids. Like I can't even assess them because they can't even write down a response, and I can't get them to do this, and they're very unmotivated. And she was the basically length of her answer was just, well, just get them to draw or sketch whatever they can and assess them on that. Or, give them an oral response. And I'm like, but they still can't read. They're going to be going into grade 9. And she was like, just look at their IEP. And of course, the answer was assistive technology. So from there, it was just an ongoing disenchantment with me thinking I was going to be going into this profession and really, helping kids to overcome learning challenges and become really good learners. And that wasn't happening at all.
Hmm.
And fast forward a few years, I had my daughter, and she started to struggle with a neuroautoimmune condition called PANS or PANDAS. That's basically neuroinflammation that affects behavior. There can even be decline in writing and reading because of the brain inflammation occurring when they're in what's called a flare. And so my husband and I started going down all kinds of rabbit holes. I had already started pursuing additional training as in like holistic therapies. Let's just put it that way for now. And we started diving into gut healing and detox, and we were seeing progress. And I was thinking, why aren't we doing this with these kids who are struggling with self-regulation and so on? And my daughter made a huge improvement, but we hit a plateau. And that's when I started seeking alternate therapies beyond the typical naturopathic type things that people often seek out in these situations. And I started learning about educational therapy and functional neurology. And as a teacher who was frustrated, I was blown away by the possibility, the research I was seeing, the case studies of kids who had severe learning disabilities, who were overcoming their challenges through educational therapies by strengthening these weak connections. So I started just seeking additional training in that. And I was like, I'm going to do this. And at that point, I was kind of angry, I guess you could say, because I was like, why are we not doing this in the school system? Why are we leading parents and kids to believe that they can't learn better, that they will always need a laptop to read for them, that they always will be reliant on medication to self-regulate when there are so many options out there? And I was starting to see those results with clients. So that's when I founded Building Better Brains, and more specifically the Full Potential Academy, where we work on addressing the underlying factors why kids are struggling.
I love it. Now, what was initially, what was your content area when you started teaching?
Well, I was working with kids who were in elementary school. So I was teaching all the things, like
Mhm.
everything from, history, geography, literature, science. I wasn't doing a whole lot with math because, as you might know, in the middle school, often that's more specialized with teachers.
Mhm.
And there was a math teacher picking that up. But I think that because I was working so much with literacy based subjects, I was seeing these. It was not possible to not see the gaps in
Yeah.
how so many of these kids were struggling with reading and writing. And I remember talking to a chiropractor of mine who was a quite older gentleman, and him saying to me, well, it's because there's a deliberate dumbing down. His wife was actually a math teacher at a high school. And that was the first time I'd heard that. And I thought, what a nut. I thought, why would they want to do that? They want a smart society. They wouldn't do that. And then years later, I read the book by John Gatto and was like, oh, okay, this must be what he was talking about. Yeah, so definitely some eye openers early in my career.
Mhm. Now, and what was your master's degree in? Because before we got on the interview, we were talking about your education a little bit.
Yeah. So my master's degree was a master's of science in teaching. So you would think with a master's of science in teaching, you would have
Mhm.
learned like interventions on identifying as well as addressing and overcoming learning challenges, self-regulation issues, and so forth. But what it really was here's curriculum, here's how to develop lesson plans. I do remember a spec ed course thinking this is going to be the course that's going to really help, the struggling learners I'm going to encounter. But all it was, okay, dyslexia, you apply this to the IEP, you do this for the IEP. And it was just all strictly, if the child comes in with this diagnosis, this is what you're going to do to manage the situation. So I remember thinking, oh, well, that's kind of crappy. Like I was really disappointed that was the extent of the answers for these kids. But I figured, well, what do I know? I'm like, what, 20, 22, 23. So
Mhm.
yeah.
So then you're as you mentioned, you were in the system, you're teaching, you're noticing like, okay, they really just want us to put band-aids on the kids and be like, well, good job. Here you go. Here's your IEP. At what point, because you mentioned like you became disenchanted, and then you started looking into holistic things. What sorts of things did you find worked that you'd never learned about before that you probably should have learned?
Right. So I'll say as a teacher, I don't expect that they would be teaching me about how much nutrition and gut health can impact the brain.
Mhm.
I understand that's a different kind of scope, if you will.
Yeah.
But by the same token, I will say I still find it absolutely flabbergasting that no one who works with learning disabilities in the mainstream system, whether it's the psychologist who, does psych ed assessments or the doctor who gives out Ritalin or whatever medication, is looking at the research on gut health, on nutrition, on
Mhm.
toxicity, because it's solid and decades old. Um, and then getting into educational therapy, one thing that was really mind blowing for me was even something as simple as retained primitive reflexes.
What
So
is
that's
what is
something.
that?
Yeah, so let me explain that because that's always just so interesting and mind blowing for people who haven't heard of it. So when our babies are babies, they have these little reflexes that are often pretty cute. Like we put them on the change table on their back, and they kind of do a little starfish outwards, or we put them on their belly and they turn their head to one side and their hands go up. That's called the ATNR reflex. That's retained in 90% of dyslexics.
Hmm.
Um, and the Moreau one, the starfish one, is the fight or flight. So your quote unquote ADHD kids who have a hard time self regulating, that's usually retained. And what retained means is that these reflexes are there in infancy and they're there for survival and development. So you put your baby on their belly and they automatically turn their head so they don't smother. It's not even a choice.
Mhm.
But those reflexes should integrate and disappear into the nervous system as kids start creeping and crawling and developing and so forth, because now those reflexes are no longer necessary. And if those reflexes remain, what happens is, to put it simply, you end up with brain blocks. So those reflexes originate in the brainstem. Good learning, all those higher order skills, as you know, take place in the prefrontal cortex. But the prefrontal cortex now has to do the job of the brainstem and inhibit these reflexes. And so it's busy. And so I'll have parents say to me, I don't understand. He can read well one day, but then he can't read the next day. Or, he could read it last week and can't this week. And that's because of these retained reflexes. So throw in, your child didn't get a lot of great sleep last night. They were at a birthday party this weekend and ate tons of candy and sugar. Maybe they had a fight with their friend. And now their brain is really overloaded. Their prefrontal cortex is dealing with a lot of stuff. And it's now having to work really hard. It can't keep up. And so that's, why your child's having a harder time reading today versus the day they have a great time reading because they rested well, they ate well, they're feeling good, all of that type of stuff. So what we want to do is, one of the big pieces that I do at the foundational level is I work on step one, integrating primitive reflexes with sensory motor exercises. And that's a huge part of my job, is trying to help parents understand that, because we all think that learning starts with paperwork and books, and that's what makes you smart. And actually what builds those connections is in infancy with sensory motor stimulation and development. And so that's the first phase of educational therapy, is getting those lower brain levels, those connections well developed through sensory motor exercises. And I often have, parents at first, or kids saying, I don't understand how this is going to help his reading. And I'm like, but it will. And again, decades of research, these reflexes were uncovered. I think it was in the 50s, if I remember correctly, when two doctors were working with men who had severe brain injuries from car accidents. And we're like, wow, that's kind of strange. They're doing movements that infants do. And they, started researching and doing exercises and having these men simulate exercises that infants do. And lo and behold, they regained their abilities. So when I have people in my program who are teachers who have kids who are struggling, and it's always very interesting to me that teachers are the people who are like, sign me up. They will say, we're not doing IEPs. We're not doing the whole school system thing. And they work in the school system and they understand how limiting it is. So I think that's very telling. And then the teachers always say to me, oh my gosh, I can't believe we didn't learn this. This is mind blowing. And every teacher I have who goes through my program for their children are the very teachers that end up now moving forward and doing it with their primary students during circle time. They're like, we're doing these exercises now at circle time. One teacher who'd been teaching for 15 years said, the last 3 years I've been doing primitive reflex integration exercises at circle time, and my kids are much further ahead halfway through the year than any other year I've ever had for the last 3 years. And to me, that's like mind blowing. I do have a client whose child was in a Waldorf school. I don't know if all Waldorf schools do this, but she said her 3 boys were always assessed as soon as they started school in JK for their reflexes, because in the Waldorf school that she was going to, they understood that there's no point in trying to drill in reading, writing, and arithmetic until these reflexes are definitely integrated. So we screen everyone first.
So is it possible then, I mean, based on the study with the 2 men, right? I think, okay, how do I say this? I think sometimes we think as parents like, oh, the child is too old, it's too late. But that's not true, is it?
Absolutely not. I have worked with teenagers, older teenagers. I've even worked with a 67-year-old, but usually I work with kids and teenagers, and parents, like you say, often feel it's too late. That's the most common thing. I literally had a mom in tears yesterday saying, I think I waited too long. That's what every mother thinks. Her kid could be 7 and she thinks she waited too long, or could be 21. So it's never too late. The brain is plastic at any age. Research has shown the brain can actually generate mature neurons and connections between those neurons right into our 80s. Wow. Is it harder? Is it going to happen really quick with a 4-year-old compared to a 12-year-old? Yes, but it doesn't mean it's insanely hard. It's going to take some more time because the brain is super plastic when we're young, but it is plastic at any age. And I always like to remind people neuroplasticity is happening to us every single day, whether we're conscious of it or not. So, the fact that we live in a society where everyone's addicted to our phones, that's neuroplasticity, right? So we create pathways with our choices every day. And whenever we do very deliberate, intentional, strategic exercises, it's impossible. The brain can't not change. No one is exempt from neuroplasticity. And I remember talking to a woman about this who does completely different work with mental health and somatic therapies. And she said, that's like, to me, God's gift to us is that no one is exempt from neuroplasticity. Even people with Down syndrome, there is a lot of potential for them to still improve. It doesn't mean that where they are right now is where they have to stay. So yeah, I'm in love with neuroplasticity, as you can see.
Well, I think it's cool. Because I think that sometimes we believe, like we come to believe, whether it's intentional by society or not, that some things like it's not possible to change. Like
Right.
just almost 3 years ago, I came to believe like I was 100 pounds overweight, and I was like, oh, I will never lose the weight because I'm too old, because I'm in my 40s and people in their 40s can't lose weight. And yet that wasn't true. I mean, I had to put in the work, but it wasn't true, you know? And I think I know that I certainly have been guilty of this with my own kids, especially my ADHD, one of my ADHD kids who, I was like, well, this is just the way he is. He just doesn't do well with executive functioning, and yet, I feel like sometimes we limit our kids because we have that belief that it's not possible for people to change. It's not possible for the brain to change once you hit a certain age,
Right.
and yet you're showing that's absolutely not true. Like, people can change and people can grow. Um, what have you in your practice? How have these labels with these kids and teens affected them emotionally?
I love that you asked that. Because one of the biggest challenges in my practice is, number one, undoing the parents' limited or fixed beliefs around their child's challenges. And then number two, particularly whenever I'm working with a kid who is probably anything older than grade 6, you're dealing with not just a learning challenge anymore or a self-regulation issue. You're dealing with a child who is almost like convinced they can't learn and starts to develop this fixed belief that I can't change, I'm broken, there's something wrong with me. And so I sometimes, I don't want to say get in trouble, but I always tell parents, what do you want out of getting a diagnosis? Like, especially if you're paying out of pocket, what are you hoping to get? What are you thinking this is going to tell you that you don't already know? And a lot of parents will say, oh, I just want some kind of confirmation or some kind of answer. And I understand that. I've been in that place as a parent, but I also feel that we also have to be careful of just seeking answers instead of solutions. Because what I see is that I work with, like, 50% of my parents are like, we got a diagnosis and now they're coming to see me. And the other 50% will say, we don't want a diagnosis. I don't care about a label. We're not doing that. We just want to find out what is going on and how to address it. And I really find that those sets of parents, their kids end up generally doing better if they, I don't want to say the other set don't, but that you have to be kind of stubborn enough to be like, no, I just don't feel that the label is the answer. And I always tell moms that, I say, you need to get stubborn, because you're up against the school system and the naysayers and everyone else who is also just in this system where they have these, fixed beliefs that have been perpetuated for decades and so forth. But yeah, it definitely has a huge impact on kids. And I think that's why so many of my homeschoolers are the ones who fare out better, because they're not being treated differently because they have that label and that IEP and all that sorts of stuff. So
Now, you had mentioned before we started filming, you shared with me a story about a gentleman and a laptop. Will you share that story?
Yeah. So I was at a what's it called, trade show last spring, and this younger couple came up to me. They were probably like around 25-ish, and this man comes up to me, this young man comes up to me right away, and he says, "Oh my goodness, I love what you're doing." And I thought, all you can see is my banner, Building Better Brains. Like, go beyond IEPs and endless tutoring. Like, thinking, how do you even know what I'm doing? And he started to tell me his story. And he said, I struggled greatly with dyslexia. And he said, I remember the day they handed me a laptop and said, this is going to help you get through school. And he said, it felt to me like they were saying, here's your new brain because yours doesn't work. And I was like so emotional for him. And I'm going to get emotional now too. Like, for me, that's criminal. He's aware of it now, how wrong that was. And he said, I still can't really read well. Thankfully, I'm really good in the trades, and I am in construction, and I do well financially. But I've seen that. I've seen it with my own brother who had dyslexia, where it really deeply impacts them. Logically, they know that there's, stuff going on in the school system that's not right. Logically, they know they're not dumb, but on a deeper level, that prevailing kind of lack of self-worth is still there. And I just want to add that I really put a step in that guy's shoe that day as he walked away, because I said, the reason that you're so good at carpentry and construction and all of that is because dyslexics have a beautifully overdeveloped right brain. That's where the visual cortex is. That's where the spatial skills reside. Emotional and social intelligence comes from the right side of the brain. And I'm like, that's why you are so good at that. I said, my grandfather was dyslexic. He dropped out in grade 3. He could hardly read. My grandmother had to take care of the whole business, but he built houses all over our community. And I said, now I know, when I started learning about functional neurology, these kids have a gift. It doesn't mean they can't learn to read. I definitely work with lots of kids where we unlock those pathways that are preventing that. And they have so much to give to the world. And that's where, for me, it's criminal, because these are the kids that often will limit themselves. They're the ones who could be our best engineers, but maybe end up being high school dropouts because they can't read. So they think they're not good at anything.
Interesting. So at what point, because you had mentioned to me earlier that you had been teaching and then your daughter had been in the public school system, but you pulled her. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So we started her off the traditional route. And I will say, even as a teacher, I was like, I really don't want to have to send her to school. Like, she's just so creative. But I was like, nobody in my area at the time was doing homeschooling. It was just like, couldn't wrap my brain around it. And she went to school. And then as I started to learn more about the school system and all the limitations, we pulled her out in grade 5 or grade halfway through grade 6. And even in grade 5, I started saying, you know what, we're just going to have days, because I had reduced my hours to part-time as I was building my business at that point. I said, we're just going to have homeschool days. And she's like, what's that? I'm like, we're going to have days where you don't go to school because you're not really learning much anyway. Like, you're going to stay home and we're going to do our own thing. And she thought this was amazing. She loved it. We did all kinds of great stuff. And then halfway through grade 6, I'm like, we're done. She was just coming home with like work that to me was so below what she was capable of. And we just pulled her out, and she really thrived. She still loves homeschooling.
And she's 17 now, correct?
She's 17 now. Yeah. She's completing a few credits she wants to go and be a criminal psychologist. Bless her heart. So yeah.
For her.
Yeah, no kidding. But what always strikes me is she loves learning still. That thank goodness the year she was in school, that wasn't taken from her. And, she'll do her credits that she needs to do for homeschooling to be able to get into the colleges, university that she would like to go to. But she's mastered Portuguese on her own accord. No one made her do that. She just loves learning, and she can speak and read fluent, she can read books in Portuguese.
Wow.
She's now learning Arabic and Italian. She wants to learn, like, it never ends, the languages she wants to learn.
That is amazing. That is
Yeah.
amazing.
And right. And I think, like, a lot of people who are homeschoolers, we see that blossoming of, like, their interests that they wouldn't have, right, if they're just in this cookie cutter curriculum. Even her interest in criminal psychology started. She started reading all kinds of books about deviant kids and teenagers and so forth. And that kind of really sparked that interest. So yeah, it's definitely been a major paradigm shift for all of us.
Wow. Very cool. And this question I asked, does she ever want to go back to public school?
No, I've asked her a few times. And she actually said to me that, I thought, that is so heartbreaking for a teenager to say that. She was like, no, that's like having, as if I had to go back to prison. Those are her actual words. She said, I remember thinking whenever I was in school the last year, I was like, oh, I have like all these years left of this. And it felt like I was going to prison. And I thought it was interesting because I don't refer to the school system as a prison system, as I know some people do. But I thought that was really insightful and kind of disturbing that a kid of that age saw it in such a way.
No, it's true. I also have a 17-year-old daughter, and a few years ago, this was 3 years ago, we were driving past as an elementary school, and she brought up the same thing. She goes, "Look, they're all lining up. There's a big fence, a chain link fence around the school. There's hardly any windows. They get a few minutes outside and then they're going back in." She's like, "Mom, it really does look like a prison." I'm like, "Yeah." And she's like, and I remember it feeling like a prison because I had to raise my hand to go to the bathroom. She goes, now I look back and I'm like, what on earth was I in? I don't ever want to go back. And I'm like, no, I gotcha. And you're not going to be going back. So
yeah,
so we're all good.
It's true. It's we know, right? It's very institutional. And something else my daughter said, and a couple other kids I've spoken to who were in high school and then switched to homeschooling, said it's like prison in that you also are hanging out with people you don't necessarily really want to hang out with.
Yeah.
But you have to pick a gang. Otherwise, you're going to get eaten alive. And my daughter even said that she felt the same way. She was hanging out with this one girl because she didn't kind of fit with this other crowd. And then there was this one girl who was associated with this other crowd. It was very basically abusive and unkind. And she's like, but if I didn't, kind of align with her, then I would have nobody. I wouldn't have been in any crowd. And I was like, oh my gosh, like that's insane. And I can relate to that. I went through the regular system, and I very much related, like a lot of us, where you're hanging out with people that, when high school's done, you're like, bye. You wouldn't.
See ya.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I remember right before graduation, this girl in one of my classes, I said to her, I said, are you sad that you're graduating? She was like, are you kidding me? I don't want to see most of these people ever again. I said, that's how I feel. I don't care if I see most of these people again. I mean, there might be a couple people here and there, and I'm like, oh, I might want to stay in touch with them, but most of them, I'm like, get me out of here.
Yeah.
The other thing that I've noticed too, as we're off on a little prison tangent, is that even like going into the lunchroom, I found for a lot of kids brings a lot of anxiety because they've got their trays and they're like, I have to find a group to sit with to eat where I don't feel ostracized. And I even talked to one mom who pulled her daughter in 7th grade, and it wasn't until after she pulled her that her daughter would get so much anxiety, and she had been bullied so much. And this mom didn't realize how bad it was that her daughter would take her tray and eat it in a bathroom stall every day for months because she felt just terrified at the lunchroom, because she was bullied, and she's like, I have nowhere to sit. I have no friends.
Mm-hmm.
And now, this is 3 years later, she's blossomed and she's confident, and she ran into some of the kids that bullied her. And she came home, she's like, Mom, she goes, they all look alike, they sound alike. And she goes, and they don't have any original thoughts or opinions. She goes, I'm so glad I am not with them. She goes, and I could smile and be myself. I was like, interesting. Anyway,
I love that you said that. That's exactly what my daughter says too, is that that they look alike. They don't have the original thoughts. And I think that's why it's so important for that homeschooling community, right? Because I think it's just that those kids are also forced to be in this box. And then it's harder, I think, when your kid is this original copy to relate. Like my daughter always feels underwhelmed whenever she's hanging out or some, associating with those people. And it's not that she thinks she's better, but she just feels underwhelmed. And she said to me one day, I don't even think they know who they are.
Oh yeah. No.
Yeah. That's to me the gift that you're giving your kid when you homeschool is they get to find out and be free enough to really find out who they are. And for me, I think there's less likelihood too, if your kid does decide to go the more traditional route and pursue a degree of them not ending up, like, I'm confident that if my daughter goes into criminal psychology, she's going there because she really feels called to do that. It's not, well, I got to pick something to fit in the box, so.
Yeah, it's true. Well, and I look at the families that I work with who are transitioning out of the system when their kids are older. And I remember this one particular family. And it was so funny because when we started homeschooling, this family was like, oh, are you sure this is a great idea? And then their teenage son, who actually was really popular in school, and did okay in school, but there were pieces where he struggled. After he had homeschooled for a few months, he's like, I didn't realize that I hadn't ever had time to figure out what I believed, what I loved, what my interests were. I didn't realize how much I was influenced by other kids and what they thought of me. And he's like, I feel free. I feel free, and so, and he's gone back and he does, some public school classes here and there, but he's like, I do these on my terms.
Right.
And I make decisions on my terms, not on what the expectations are of me anymore. So it was really fascinating watching his journey, this kid's journey, who's now a senior in high school. So let's talk. Okay. So what are some things that parents, which I think is interesting because your practice, you don't work solely with homeschooling families, although what is the breakdown for you?
Yeah. So 50%, I would say about half my clients are homeschoolers. So I do work with homeschool families, but I don't just work with homeschool families because I feel very called to support these families that for whatever reason their kid is in the school system to kind of like help them see there is another way. If you're not going to do homeschooling and your kid is struggling, there is another way. Beyond these IEPs and tutors and meds and all of this type of stuff that's just endless. And it's always interesting too. I do tell parents you have to do what feels right. It's never my place, obviously, to say you should be homeschooling. But it's always, I do have parents that do end up deciding to homeschool. And sometimes it's just because no one's ever really given them permission to even consider that, right? Which I'm sure you see as well. And then there's all of these, I know I went through that as a teacher, blocks of like, what if this, or what if my kid isn't socialized properly? Or what about high school? How are they going to get if they want a university? Or you think there's all these limitations, which I
don't exist.
There's no limitations, truly, really. But so yeah, I feel deeply called to, I don't feel I can change the school system. I tried to do that and burnt out pretty quickly. But I feel that I at least need to like ruffle some feathers, not for the sakes of ruffling feathers, but to help save some of these kids who are stuck in this system, that they can still thrive and do well and not be limited.
What are some things that they can do at home that parents can start to do at home to help their kids that might be struggling with like reading or executive functioning or whatever else the IEP label has given them.
Right.
Are there practical things that parents can physically do with their kids?
Yes, absolutely. So, I mean, I would definitely say if your child is struggling with things like reading and writing, I would actually pull back from, and if it's been an ongoing battle and you're not seeing a whole lot of progress, pull back from the reading and writing right now, as crazy as that sounds, and work on the lower brain levels, work on integrating primitive reflexes. If I have like a freebie I can send to you that you can share with them if you want, with different exercises that are starter exercises to build brain connections. If your child is like slumpy, has poor coordination, even just simple stuff, like sometimes it's not obvious. Maybe they just had a hard time learning to ride a bike. Maybe they weren't great in swimming lessons. Or maybe they were good in those things, but they don't have great fine motor skills. Those are all indications that they have retained primitive reflexes, which are not always obvious. And one of the best ways, if like you couldn't for some reason work on actively integrating reflexes, is sensory motor stimulation. So like martial arts, dance class, those are the two biggest ways to help improve the connectivity in the brain. You're having to, especially with dance, you're having to optimize timing or be on time with the music. That helps with processing speed and so forth. But getting kids outside, being rough and tumble kids the way they used to be, that's a huge reason why so many of our kids do have retained reflexes today. Another really common one, it seems so simple, is core strength. If the core muscles aren't strong, the eyes won't track, the handwriting will be poor, focus will be poor. Parents are always blown away by how much we can shift things just by doing like core strengthening exercises and then moving up to like they can now hold the Superman for 2 full minutes. And wow, look at how much their coordination and fine motor skills have improved. So those are some basics that I would definitely say to start with in terms of the foundational skills. And then the obvious things, which I feel like most homeschoolers are pretty aware of these days, is, good nutrition, working on gut health, avoiding toxins, those types of things. But I even work with, a lot of homeschoolers who are very savvy in those things. And then sometimes we do functional health tests and find out, oh my goodness, this kid has like insane mercury or insane cadmium or aluminum or whatever. Or their gut is a mess for whatever reason. And so sometimes you need to work with someone to rule out those things. It's not always super obvious, but I always say start with the basics, like good nutrition and those simple things like sensory motor exercises and so on.
Okay, so which you bring up something interesting because my youngest was diagnosed with sensory processing disorder as a child. Is that connected to what you do?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that was a big thing with my daughter with sensory processing disorder. So that's what I see when I'm working with kids who have sensory processing disorder is there's a combo of weak connections, particularly in the vestibular with the vestibular and proprioceptive system. So like top reflexes that I've looked into is the TLR, the tonic labyrinthine reflex. So the TLR, the Moro, MORO, and spinal galant is another common one. So those are just off the top of my head. Sometimes there's like hemispheric imbalance where one, like the left side of the brain is way more typically sensory. And so it's overstimulated. We need to get the right brain online a little bit more just to calm things down. And then I like with my daughter, a huge part of it was fungus, like mold in her house. She had candida in her gut. And it was a whole new world whenever we cleared the mold, and so forth. Basically it was causing inflammation and irritability and all that kind of stuff. So it's definitely multi-layered. It's never just one kind of, this is what it is for every kid, but, yeah, it's very, very common whenever there's imbalance or disconnect.
Interesting. Yeah, and I think about that. I was surprised when and she was diagnosed what at 3, because
Right.
we saw everything from the time she was an infant. And I kept going to the pediatrician and saying something is not right. This is my biological fourth child. Biologically, this is my fourth child, but it's my sixth child.
Right.
Um, and something's off. And he kept saying, "No, there's nothing wrong. There's nothing." And finally, it was actually the physician's assistant who said, "Oh, have you ever had her checked for sensory processing disorder?" I'm like, "No." And so then we did, and after 9 months of therapy, it was like I had a different child, and she was happy. But as you mentioned, like the rough and tumble play, when we would go to the physical therapy, that's what they would have her do, is like just
Yeah.
really rough stuff that I was like, "Oh, okay, I could have done some of this stuff at home had I known," right? Like,
I know, 100%.
but it was so great, and it was so cool watching her shift, and her change, and her, like that.
Yeah.
And now she's almost 10, and she does great, and we don't have meltdowns anymore, and all the things that
Right.
we saw when she was little. But as you were talking, I'm like, oh, so much of this sounds like some of the things that you might do in physical therapy, that the brain isn't working right because the body needs some different things.
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, that's the first tier I work with. It's what I call the learning pyramid. So at the base is those primitive reflexes and the types of things you would do with OT and physical therapy. Um, and then as you move up, you work on things like processing speed or timing, hemispheric integration. And then further up, there's cognitive or educational therapy that's more cognitive, but it's not the same as tutoring because we're not working on practicing a subject. We're working on improving visual memory and auditory processing and processing speed itself and all of those things with kind of different games that they will also do those types of cognitive therapies with someone at the right time who's had a stroke. Um, so it's like, I guess, mind blowing to me that when you look at the learning pyramid, where schools are working is at the very tip of the learning pyramid,
Interesting.
but
Yeah.
there's all this stuff that has to happen first that's not being addressed. And so when parents say, well, if learning disabilities can be overcome, like, why is there so many struggling still as adults and don't overcome it? Like, because they've been in the school system.
Yeah.
And or even, just the medical system that just band-aids everything. But once you address these underlying layers, the miracle stories, like even Barbara Arrowsmith, a lot of people know about her. She will say in her words that in the 1950s, she was diagnosed as being profoundly mentally retarded, was the terminology. And she said, I was so lost. It was so severe. And she now has a master's degree and runs schools all over the world to work with kids who have learning disabilities. And she does these cognitive therapies as well and so on. And she will say there is absolutely no excuse in this day and age for a child with learning disability to continue to struggle in that manner with all of the research we know about neuroplasticity. And so when you hear these miracle stories like Barbara Arrowsmith, it's not a miracle story. It's that someone went off the beaten path and did something different than the conventional approach.
I love that.
Yeah.
What's one question that you wish I would have asked you today?
Ooh, one question you wish I would. I don't know, Janae. I have to think about that. I think it's that I was going to say what parents can do at home, but you already asked that. So I don't really have a question I can think of. I feel like you covered so much, to be honest.
Well, then, if you had one word of advice for parents, public school, homeschool, doesn't matter.
Okay.
What's the one piece of advice that you like? Oh, this is so important for parents to know. What would you say?
Yeah. So definitely the one piece of advice that I feel like I'm constantly trying to scream from the rooftops is that learning challenges do not have to be permanent. And I know that for a lot of people, that sounds like a really bold statement. But it's not just my opinion, though I have seen it in practice over and over again. But it's the research is there, it's very solid. And so my advice to parents is do not accept the diagnosis as the end of the story. If you do pursue a diagnosis, fine. It's the beginning of the story. It's not the end. And to look into therapies that are going to address the root of the problem and not just manage it, because your child is going to follow your lead. So if you kind of just throw your arms up in defeat and we're like, we'll just have to use the laptop or whatever, of course they're going to assume that's all we can do, because that's, you're the adult. And it's really important to show your kid that there is alternate solutions. It's not easy. I'm not going to sit here and say we're going to wave a wand and in 3 months the dyslexia is going to be gone. But there's definitely really effective research-based therapies to overcome these challenges so that your child is not limited in both what they want to do. And for me, the most detrimental and devastating thing that I see is the devastation to the self-confidence and self-worth.
Wow. Now, if people want to get a hold of you, if they want to find out about Full Potential Academy and about Building Better Brains Learning Clinic, how can they reach you?
Yeah, so they can head to my website, which is lorrainedriscoll.com, or my Instagram page or account, Building Better Brains. And I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. So I'm on YouTube as well, Building Better Brains. So I'm on all the platforms basically.
Fantastic. And I will put in the show notes links to your website as well as that the download that parents can use to help their kids. Lorraine, thank you so much for taking the time today to share your knowledge and expertise and the confidence that as I was listening to you, I'm like, yes, everybody needs to know, like, it doesn't have to be permanent. Things don't have to be permanent. I love that. So thank you for bringing in that element of confidence that I think so many of us often lack, and that knowledge that we've been taught something different. And the truth is the brain can change, the brain can grow, and kids don't have to be stuck with the label that they're given. Thank you. Thank you for coming today. Mamas and papas, grandmas and grandpas, you are doing so much better than you think you are. You got this, and we will talk next week.